What if we got rid of youth football? Last week we had the NFL draft. Everybody was fired up. We've got fantasy leagues everywhere. We've got football out there. It's one of the major sports in the country. Multi-billion-dollar business. But what about the risks, especially for younger kids who are playing football? Well, in Texas, where they're football crazy, they are starting to do some things down there in some places that are taking care of some of the physical dangers of the sport. There was a school board there in a place called Marshall, Texas, where they decided to shut down the district's entry-level tackle football program for seventh graders in favor of flag football. And there was little objection. Now, you might think, well, geez, in Texas, they'd be just tearing down the roof. But no, not at all. With us this morning, the gentleman who deals with this kind of thing on a regular basis, he's Dr. Brandon Brock, staff clinician at the Carrick Brain Headquarters in Dallas, Texas, and he's with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Good morning, Dr. Brock. How are you?
Good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Now, you get to deal with brain injuries all the time, and obviously this is happening down in your neck of the woods in Texas right now. What is going on there? Have people kind of, I hate to say lost their minds here, but have they gone off the deep end?
Well, I think what's happening is the general public is now sort of being educated from a layman's standpoint about what the research is showing, and they're finally realizing that they don't want their kids to grow up and not being able to do their math homework and, to be able to go to college and have enough common sense and brain power left to live a life beyond Pee Wee football. When you have kids, well, I have little kids, they're both girls, but I deal with lots of young Pop Warner football players, and parents are really getting concerned because these kids are taking harder shots and they're getting concussions. So we have to be concerned, and they understand now what the research is showing. So there's a bigger public awareness, I think, is one of the things that's triggering this.
Obviously, we have a culture that espouses football big time. It is woven into our culture, even much like baseball. And yet at the same time, as you mentioned, over the past bunch of years, we've really stepped in and seen the kinds of head trauma injuries that can happen. I know as a coach of basketball for a long time, we had a lot of extra education on concussions and how we deal with those now. It's a much more serious problem in terms of how you let people get back and recover. So when you look at this, is there a safe time to get into football, or is this a move that you see at the beginning to get rid of football overall?
There's really never a safe time. A head injury is a head injury.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're 80 or if you're 8. It's not good either way. And here's the thing that we're finding that is really scary to us. You may get a head injury, and you may recover, and you may seem fairly normal, but it sets into motion certain physiological things that 10, 12, 15, 30, 40 years down the road come back to haunt you. And that's what's making us say, we got to protect kids because they want to play. They don't necessarily have the knowledge to make a decision to not go play. And that's why parents are trying to become empowered, because the research shows you can be 8, 9, 10 in junior high and even in high school and take these hard shots. And, you recover within a week or two, but then down the road, the symptoms start to come back, and we're finding out it might be linked to the concussion you had 10 years ago.
Dr. Brock, when you mentioned something very important here, that you can't teach kids at that age, 11 and 12-year-olds necessarily, or even younger, how to fall, how to deal with different kinds of tackling and so forth. And so a developmental situation comes along here from where I'm sitting, and we say, okay, is there a too early time to get into this? Is there a better time later on where we're able to do those things? We're more dexterous, we're more flexible, whatever it might be. I often think back to my lessons in early health class about the head kneading together and how long that takes and so forth. I know I'm asking you about 18 million questions in this one, but is there any decent time here to go into this from where you're sitting as far as football specifically is concerned?
Well, there's several angles here that I could probably answer this question from. Number one is, you have a young kid that still has a developing brain. So when they get a head injury too early, you run the risk of them not going through the normal stages of development. And a brain will develop and is not mature until you're in your early 20s. Now, once you get older and you're on the flip side of that and you get a head injury, now we worry about you kind of like starting to go down the other side of the hill faster than we want you to. So if you're too young, we worry about you not developing the right way. And then when you get older, we worry about it setting in a pathological process faster than it should. I mean, we don't want you to start getting degenerative brain disease in your 20s when you should be getting that in your 60s and 70s. And so we have multiple concerns from multiple angles. And so when you're younger, the answer is there an age that's appropriate? Well, from a sheer head injury point of view, the answer is it's really difficult to say. You know, your neck has to be strong enough to hold your helmet up. You have to be old enough to understand the rules of how to hit and how to tackle. You've got to be old enough to understand the rules of the game so that you don't put yourself in a situation where you're more prone for injury. You know, so there's different experts have different opinions, and really at this point in time, they're all opinions. The research is pretty varied. You know, we know that you need to be anywhere from 8 to 12 before you can start developing the intellectual capacity to follow the rules. You know, and once you get into middle school, you have the strength to handle a hit a little bit better. I mean, if your neck is weak, your chances for a head injury go way up.
Yeah, and you watch some of these kids. I go by some practices now and then. I see some of these younger leagues, and the helmet almost looks like it's just, just too big for the head, frankly. Yeah,
they look like bobbleheads, and you're like, there's absolutely no way that this person can tolerate not just a head injury, but they're going to get a neck injury, and then they're going to fall, and then they risk, damaging a shoulder and an elbow and a hand. And hey, look, football is a big thing here. I mean, I've got relatives in Marshall, Texas,
right.
And I've been to Marshall football games for the last 10 to 15 years, and it's a big deal. It's a small town. It's the cultural environment. It's the thing that everybody does. So if you see people in that neck of the woods in East Texas that are starting to now come around and say, you know what, maybe we should reevaluate this. That is a sheer litmus test that this is a serious situation that people are really starting to pay more attention to. They just don't want their kids to be messed up.
We're also seeing a lot of former NFL players, former players who are coming out the other side of their playing days, and they're saying, look what happened. Look at some of the damage has been done. So the visual evidence of that is now starting to come out more and more and more in a world that has visual out there 24/7 on computers, TV, and everywhere else.
Yeah, that's right. It's one thing when you watch your hero catching the pass, making the touchdown, doing all this glorious stuff. What's even more striking is when you see that same hero that can barely walk out on the field and can't remember where they parked their car and now has to be, be in an assisted living facility. And when you see that, now all of a sudden you say, wow, I don't know if the glory and the fame was really worth the outcome. And everybody's different. Not everybody's going to be that way, but you're going to see it in the future. There's going to be more and more and more professional people come out. There's more than you think. We know this because we treat a lot of them. And a lot of them just choose to live a private lifestyle. You never really know how bad they are. They come out of the public light. There's a tremendous number of professional athletes that are just disabled.
We're talking with Dr. Brandon Brock, staff clinician at the Carrick Brain Headquarters in Dallas, Texas. And the article that's out there, by the way, if you want to read it, is by Ken Belson. It's in the New York Times. Football's risks sink in even in the heart of Texas. Yep. I was reading, this one guy was talking about his son, and he said his oldest son played a couple years of youth football, but his two younger sons are not following him now. And he said the father said he hears more about baseball, basketball, and soccer these days. Football, he said, is more of an acquired taste, quote unquote. But he's still in soccer. We're still talking about, the ball hitting to the heads, those kind of things. I mean, are there any other sports here that we say, well, maybe we're starting those too early as well?
Well, I got to be honest with you. Female soccer is the number 2 sport that has, head injuries.
Right.
So, we're sitting here and we're like, well, okay, soccer is a great sport, but, people are using their head. They're using their head as part of the sport. So that's like just begging for head injury.
Now, you don't. I wouldn't think you have the same kind of collision factor all the time, but you still are when you're using your head. I played soccer, and I know what it feels like. It's not going to be something good. And again, I'm thinking, as you were talking earlier about, our brain doesn't get fully developed until we're in our 20s. Is that really necessarily a great thing?
Yeah, it's not a great thing. And let me go back to the soccer analogy again. Here's the real problem with it. If you get one real bad concussion, you know you have to stay out, and everybody agrees on that.
Right.
But when you have multiple small periods of micro trauma, like heading a ball over and over and over during practice, and you don't have that point where you are knocked out or whatever, you're still accumulating minimal amount of trauma that over time accumulates, and you start to get symptoms, but you can't pinpoint it to one incident, so the chances of you being pulled out or being treated appropriately go down. So we see pretty bad complications from people who don't have that one big bad incident, that they just have minimal micro trauma to the head that's repetitive over and over and over. We're finding that that's just as devastating. I mean, we're seeing that as clinicians.
We're talking with Dr. Brandon Brock. I can remember back in the old days when I was coaching. This was back in the probably late 90s, early 90s. And I had a kid who got bagged on the basketball court during a big game. And he came over and we checked him and we, put the fingers up in front of him and he gave all the right answers. He seemed like he was okay. We looked at it. In those times, you didn't have all the things about concussions that we have today. He went back in the game. He played well. Didn't seem to have anything left over. That night, he was taken to the hospital, was throwing up, all these horrible things happened, and he was in the hospital for the weekend. Today, we have, I know with sports medicine, we have things that we have to follow. And having coached today in high school, I followed those to the letter. And I said, he's on your team right now. I said, once he gets or she gets cured, then they'll be on my team, but I'm waiting till you tell me. So take us through what happens with the brain that you see. You're the guy on the receiving end then once these kids get to the hospital or once these people get to the hospital. What are we looking at here in terms of the things that you're seeing then?
Yeah, well, when that initial person has that head injury, due to the electrophysiology of the brain, they may just get knocked out. But they come back around because the brain's pretty good about sort of rebooting itself.
Okay.
But then what happens is there can be a bleed, a tear, there can be the onset of inflammation. So what happens is it's not an immediate deal. So the person goes home, they've kind of woke up, they're kind of oriented again, and they seem like they're probably going to pull out of it. But then if they have a bleed, the bleed starts causing compression on the brain. Or if they have massive inflammation, it starts to shut parts of the brain down. Or if there's another, skull fracture or anatomical problem, then it starts to manifest itself a little bit more slowly. So as the person gets compression or more brain problems, they get nausea, they start vomiting, their pupils don't react well, and then you're in a situation where there could be a real crisis, to the point to where they have to have, an emergency procedure, emergency medications. So that's why it's very important that not only do we look at people when it happens, but that they're monitored for a period of time very closely. And that's, within 24 to 48 hours. And then even after that, we have to make sure that once they're out of that crisis situation, that now they're going through and they're not developing chronic symptoms and then starting to slide downhill that way. So now we know sort of the phases of recovery and the phases of injury, and we know the things that can sneak up on us clinically. So we can put measures in place at each level so that stuff doesn't happen and somebody has a lower chance of dying or having really bad complications.
We're talking about getting rid of like 7th grade youth football on an article that was in the New York Times, and it's down in Marshall, Texas. Doctor, when we come back, I wanted to ask you about repeat concussions and why, we hear doctors always say, if you get repeated concussions, you're going to have worse things off. Now, I don't mean to sound oversimplified, but I'd like you, if you can medically, to explain, what happens there with repeated concussions and kind of put a bow on this whole story. Dr. Brandon Brock will be right back with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Fascinating stuff. And I'll also ask him the question, I know everybody's out there going, well, I was a kid, I did it, I'm okay now. Are we becoming wussified? That'll be one of the things I'm sure is in back of people's mind. Maybe not exactly in those terms, but you know what I'm talking about. We'll ask the doctor about that. Dr. Brandon Brock from the Carrick Brain Center in Dallas, Texas, with us here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We're talking with Dr. Brandon Brock, staff clinician at the Carrick Brain Headquarters in Dallas, Texas. And we're talking about an article in the New York Times, football's risks sinking in, even in the heart of Texas, where, we all know Texas football crazy. That's where America's team lives too, right? Anyway, Dr. Brock, we were asking you before we went to the break here. Mm-hmm. We hear people say, okay, when you have a repeated concussion, I had a girl last year that had a concussion, and she'd had like 3 before that, and I said, I really don't want you playing. I mean, it's just the way it is. From your standpoint, we often hear that, okay, over and over again, it's not a good thing. Why is it not a good thing? What are the things that you see, and what are the things that are really just happening when you have repeated concussions for kids like that?
Well, when you have a concussion, there's a natural inflammatory response. It's just like if you cut your arm or bruise your leg, the immune system kind of goes into effect, and you create inflammation so that you can start healing damaged tissue. Well, the same thing happens in the brain. You get an inflammatory response, and it does its thing, and it lasts for a couple of weeks with a head injury, and then it starts to kind of go away. And really, in most people, that response lasts a certain period of time. And this is why when somebody has a head injury, we really want them to rest and to not do much and to kind of take it easy so that inflammatory response can just do its thing. Well, what we find is that every time that occurs and every time there's a head injury, the cells in your brain that make the inflammatory chemicals get primed, or they get more sensitized. So now it takes less force to have greater symptoms because those cells are now more sensitive. So the second head injury is even worse, especially if you don't give enough time between those head injuries. So if somebody has a head injury and they only go for a week and then they go back onto the field and they have another one, those cells get turned on at an even higher rate and they do even more damage, and now they stay on even longer. And what we found is that if you've had enough concussions, sometimes those cells will turn on and stay on, and we just simply can't get them to turn off.
Wow.
And that's when we start getting things like chronic traumatic encephalopathy that all these professional football players are getting in their fourth and fifth decades of life.
We look at someone like Muhammad Ali, who not a football player, but obviously got a lot of punches late in his career. And we see him today with Parkinson's. Is Parkinson's an outgrowth of part of that, or is Parkinson's something separate altogether?
Well, Parkinson's can be caused by a lot of different factors, and there's genetic variants, there's environmental triggers. And then for somebody like Muhammad Ali, there's a pugilistic trigger, meaning, he got hit in the head so many times that literally the trauma and the inflammation triggered a genetic response in him, and that genetic response turned into a dystonic movement like Parkinson's disease.
Right.
So, interestingly enough, we're finding that trauma can trigger some of those genetic diseases that you may have living in your genome, and maybe they manifest themselves earlier in life than they would. You're sitting there, and maybe he would have got Parkinson's in his 70s or 80s, who knows? But he gets hit in the head, and now he's got it as a young man.
Right.
And so we know that this trauma, it just takes all the crappy stuff in your genes, and it increases the probability that you can express those genes and now have the disease or the symptoms manifest themselves, which is bad.
Dr. Brock, we started this a little while ago, but we now look at this and we say, okay, we're seeing changes in our country, reaction to the idea that, brain injuries are serious now. So when you hear people now come out, and I'm sure there are people in Marshall and other places around Texas and around the country who are going to say, well, we're just wussifying our nation a little bit more. When I was a kid, I did this. I didn't, look at me now. I'm fine. How do you answer them in kind of the final statement today?
Well, you got to look at things like this, especially when we look at higher-level football players. One of the things that's happened is coaches are being told they have better technology. Oh, here's this helmet. Here's these pads.
Right.
Kids can run full speed. There's absolutely no way they're ever going to get injured. I mean, when I was younger, I knew the limitation of my equipment. So sometimes you didn't hit somebody as hard as you knew you could, or you didn't use your head as a battering ram. These kids are being told these helmets like the greatest thing in the world. So now they're a little bit more careless. They hit people at a higher speed, and they do it more often. And here's the answer. Helmets do not reduce concussions because the brain is like a gelatinous thing sitting inside a hard vault. So when you hit your head, that thing squishes around. It doesn't matter how much padding you have. Helmets don't reduce concussions. Now, they may reduce damage to your skull, but all it does is give you a false sense of security, and that has become a real issue. And people are becoming more athletic, which is becoming part of the issue. And now, people are playing football more. Now, instead of having a break period during the off season, now they're going off into these other private leagues, and so they're playing football all year round. So they accumulate trauma continuously. So there's really no downtime.
Dr. Brock, it's been fascinating today listening to this, and I hope we can continue our discussion at some later date because it's just amazing to get inside this. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. Anytime you need me, I'm here for you, okay?
We'll do that. Thank you so much. Dr. Brandon Brock, a staff clinician at the Carrick Brain Headquarters in Dallas, Texas. He deals with brain injuries all the time, and it's all about the knocking out seventh grade football down in Texas. Yeah, of all places. And is it a good idea or a bad idea? Continue to look more into concussions and brain injuries.